Joining me as promised is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He's the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, and he's called Speaker McCarthy's debt ceiling bill, quote, a ransom note. Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here. Let's talk about what might happen if the White House and Kevin McCarthy can't come to an agreement. What should happen?
Well, what they need to do is to come to an agreement. The two choices that Speaker McCarthy has offered the American people are both terrible. One would cost 1 million jobs a year nearly. The other would cost 780,000 jobs a year. One would knock $146 billion off of our annual GDP. The other would push us into a recession. Those are completely false and unnecessary choices that are being driven by their big donors and their big fossil fuel polluters. So it's just not tenable to allow that to be the way this gets settled.
The Republicans do control the House, though, so you might disagree with them on everything. You might call it a ransom note. You might say they're being influenced by fossil fuel companies, et cetera, but they control the House. And without them getting into agreement with the White House, it's not going anywhere. So,
well, that's where the discharge.
Yeah, talk to me about the
discharge. That's where the discharge petition can come in handy, because it provides an alternative way for the House to make its voice heard. And so there's that route. And then, as Chuck Schumer has said, as the president has said, we're happy to have conversations about the budget, about deficits, about spending, about revenues. But those should happen in the proper light of day through the relevant committees in the way that the founding fathers set this all up, not in some kind of a backroom deal cooked up by extremists that nobody has ever kicked the tires of.
So I know Heather Boushey didn't quite answer this question, but there has been reporting that the White House potentially sees Speaker or Minority Leader McConnell as not an ally, it's maybe too strong, but a helpful presence in the room on negotiations. Why might he be a helpful presence?
Because in the past, Leader McConnell has had a role in defusing these situations. I think he is a more sensible voice in the room than the MAGA extremists who are driving Speaker McCarthy. And I think that senators on his side don't want to flirt with a default and the catastrophe that ensues. So I think they'll react more readily to the threats and the tremors as the economy begins to shake.
Is there anything worth negotiating on? Speaker McCarthy wants to cut all of this discretionary spending. Is there room, not in non-discretionary spending, or in non-discretionary spending of the defense budget, is there room to cut from defense in a meaningful way in order to get the debt limit down?
There are lots of ways to address spending issues and revenue issues and move our way towards a debt to GDP ratio that the economy can sustain. There are lots of ways to do that. The one way not to do that is to threaten a choice between a million job killer and a 780,000 job killer and say it's one or the other when neither is necessary. So they're just going to have to back off that really reckless stance.
I want to ask you about Judge Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. I saw you on Lawrence O'Donnell last night, and you were very adamant that there should be rules in place, rules that should be followed by all of the justices when it comes to ethics, and that you believe Clarence Thomas has really crossed a line by accepting these lavish gifts from that very wealthy GOP donor, for accepting the rent payments for his mother's house from that very wealthy GOP donor. What consequences are there on the table for his actions? If the Supreme Court is not going to hold him accountable, what can Congress do?
Well, what Congress can do is to make sure that this does not happen again. One, we can try to keep our eyes on the internal judicial process that might lead to a referral to the Attorney General. That's within the statute, to assess a civil penalty if they thought that his failings to file were willful. And the second thing is that we can make sure that they actually have rules and a process for enforcing them, so this nonsense stops happening. This has happened too often. This is not the first time. Justice Thomas is a repeat offender on these filing violations, and other judges don't do that. It's only the Supreme Court. So it's actually quite easy to transplant from the other federal courts, from the circuits, to the court, a proven way of reporting, testing, investigating, enforcing among judges.
So is that something that Congress passes? Is it new rules Congress passes, or is it something that the Supreme Court has to enforce on itself? How does that work?
Well, the bill that I'm pushing has a 180-day grace period for the Supreme Court to set up its own process so that for real at last, they have some ethics accountability. If that doesn't happen, then we kick in with a program based very closely on the program that already exists among all 13 United States Court of Appeals circuit courts that cover all the federal judges in each circuit. And I think it's a pretty sensible thing to suggest that the Supreme Court should be following the model that all the other senior judges of the federal court are following.
It's always been a curious thing that they were exempted from those rules.
Well, they exempted themselves.
Yeah, Senator, thank you very much. Sheldon Whitehouse, we appreciate your time and your thoughts on both these hot topics today. Thanks.
Good to be with you.